move on to the next segment. So for now, I'll just start by saying that you definitely benefit from a state store by, first of all, separating your data in a distinct data layer, right? So that's something you can benefit from, because once you start navigating your application, say for example you're looking for the post page, and then you want to understand what's going on there, you have like this folder of state where you can see post state. Once you're used to having a architecture of the state store, then you know that every operation, every change in the state should be happening somewhere, either in post state, the state object itself, or somewhere in the service layer, right? So you'd be looking at these two places to understand like, what are my data options, what are the options to handle it, and that would give you a clear perspective right away of what can be done in the application and what's missing if you are still developing, or where to look for a potential bug. So reason number one to have this state store architecture is because it's far easier to understand this entire application when you have so many parts moving along. So just a quick overview of what we have here. So in this case right now we have around 50k lines of code, right, in Dart, which is not that much for big projects, but for a startup it's already like becoming a bit complex, and for a small project that would be already unwieldy, right? So there's quite a lot of stuff to remember, right, when you develop your app, and obviously nobody has the brain capacity to remember all these lines of code. And then there's code that I haven't seen myself, like somebody else is working on it. Say for example, I would have like somebody building the profile page, right? And I'm not working on it, you're not working on it, but somebody else is working on it. And then you go there and you see the same stuff, right? So it's again, get profile, subscribe to profile, right? Looks alike. And then you have the unsubscription, and then you have like the service layer, you see the same pattern. And then you have like this state. By now you know how it's supposed to work, right? So it's repetitive, which means like you will quickly find where everything is located. And that happens whether you are using blocks or Redux or Riverpod, whichever of these. That's already a great benefit, because you can predict where a certain feature should be located. And then like a good development team should always stick with the pattern. And I'll tell you from experience, there's little reason to deviate from it. Like very few cases you'd not have this pattern in place. And if that is the situation for you, then I would advise you, okay, do write a documentation comment there explaining why, right? Because comments always should explain why. So write this particular comment explaining, hey, we did something very weird in this location and you need to understand it. And I could use a example from our own code base. So we have like a place where we use combine latest, we combine some streams together. And I think that's not the best example because it's possibly a bit easier to understand. But here, for example, this one, there's a lot more going, right? So we had to explain, okay, there's something related to performance and we had to do this and that. And we do explain the departure from the regular pattern such that when you get there, you start reading it and you understand, okay, so I'm supposed to do this or that, right? It will save you the time. But in general, you should stay on the same pattern. That will save you lots of time. That will reduce the likelihood of creating new bugs, right? Because if you repeat the same successful recipe, it's less likely that you are going to create new problems in the code base. So it will kind of benefit you on multiple fronts, and that speeds you up during development and speeds you up during debugging. That's like you win again and again and again. So there's good reason to have a state store. Now, another reason to consider, this state store thing is domain boundaries, right? That's something we had other talks in the past on this server, but I'll just explain quickly, like a domain boundary, a good applications should have like domain boundaries, meaning that, objects do not depend on each other strongly. There's like little tight coupling in your application. So when you have like good domain boundaries, it means that, for example, this particular list here, if you have activities, doesn't know anything about the posts, right? And it shouldn't. They should be different features with different data sets. They should be able to work separately. Nothing should fail because one or the other is missing. And that means you have a good domain boundary between these two. And you know exactly where to find details about the activity or where to find details about the posts, because they are not merged together in the modeling stage, right? So that's a quick explanation. We can talk many times over in other talks, but I just want to say, like, a state store will help you to have good domain boundaries. And of course, you can have good domain boundaries without a state store. But once you go into the business of like creating state stores, then you train your mind to better understand where to cut, your data and how to place it into tiny boxes, right? And here I said like common pattern for the entire team. That was already explained. That means like if you have a application where it's growing in scope, and you want to have more people joining, it's very nice to have a consistent way of making things the same, because you do a bit of onboarding with these new devs and they will see like how it's done in one module, and then they can jump in other modules. So if I worked here in the posts, even if I do posts, like it's almost the same reasoning when I do discussions. And that basically means developers that have been working in discussions or in posts or wherever, they can jump between modules quite easily. And then that can be scaled up to an entire company. And here I can specify that that's the reason why many corporations favor Angular when they have to choose between Angular and React, they will always go to Angular, because Angular is very opinionated, right? So it means like Angular framework will have very clear and established ways of like loading modules, handling routing, doing lazy loading and all sorts of stuff, right? And that means like you train your developers on this particular concept of building apps in Angular, and then they can easily jump from one project to another. That gives you flexibility as a big company. It means like if you have one of these projects that maybe has to scale up, then you can bring people from other projects, or you can hire new people from the market, right? If you have a project that dies, then you can at least rescue the developers such that you can keep them in the company by moving them in other projects. So that means you have great mobility in the company. That's why you would like to have consistent patterns. And by having a state store, once again, you help with this part of like creating a code base that can scale, that can grow in the future, and it helps, people migrating around, right? Now, on the concern side, I could say like definitely it's not easy for beginners to handle a state store. And here you would have lots of people that would advise not all projects need a state store, right? And I'm also of the same opinion. So if, for example, you have a small app which is just a tiny, Flappy Bird clone, or maybe it's just doing a to-do list or something like this, then going into the hassle of setting a state store in your app might be not productive, because you don't get the benefits. And you don't get the benefits mostly because you don't have that many modules that repeat, So one easy way of figuring out if you want a state store or not, just look at the number of endpoints that you have. If your app has more than 10 endpoints, it's probably already, kind of potentially benefiting from a state store. If it's 20, definitely have a state store. If you go beyond 20 endpoints, there's no way to move around in this app without major friction. if you don't install a state store, right? So it will help you find your data and data streams and sources and so on. It will help you quickly understand like how to move between modules and so on. So the bigger the app, the more you need a state store. That's the answer to the concern of like whether I need a state store or not, right? So could it be a overkill if I have, you know, a tiny project? Yeah, it could be. Do you plan to build something that will grow big in the future and has, you know, expectation that it has like many people that will use this app and it will grow with many features? Then definitely start considering using a state store, right? So these are some concerns regarding having or not having state stores. And I'll also explain a bit like some benefits and some concerns of having this particular architecture that I showed you with RX streams, right? So the reasoning why I chose this architecture of like state store with streams, it's simple. I do like to have repeating modules in the application, and this is a large code base and has so many modules, right? It has all sorts of stuff going around. And I mean, like just by looking at the, let's just collapse everything because it's a bit easier. So I'm gonna show you like quickly how many modules are now, and there will be far more, right? So they are even grouped at a higher level because it helps us navigate through the code base. Usually you'd have only this layer, but for us, this is just, it keeps growing, and we need, you know, a way of easily navigating and arriving to our features when we look around. So having this state store, you know, it helps us to create multiple modules, and it helps us to organize information in layers. And I prefer to have this particular setup in this project because there are extremely numerous data sources, and I want to be able to group them by, you know, layers of concern. So I have repositories, I have spaces, I have, not spaces, I have services, there's like mock data, there are models and so on. A lot of stuff to be managing. So it helps me a lot when I write, you know, large modules such as articles. Say, for example, the article page, which is a great example in our case. You see, like this page right now has only 500 lines of code, right? It's rather small, although the article page itself is a large page with lots of features. It has like an insane amount of features, although they are not like readily visible. All I can tell you is that it has a lot of code, and therefore it would not be feasible to host it all of this code in one place, right? So we need to layer it in different buckets, and that's why I have like a bunch of services around, right, with different purposes of different needs of the application. So therefore I need the ability of grouping code by you know, the role in the system that they provide. And therefore for me it's very important to have quick access to these methods, understand which one does what and so on. So therefore I need the service layer, right? The idea of having services. And if I use, you know, for example, blocks, or if I use Riverpod, then these frameworks are a bit opinionated. They have a different way of like setting up code and where it's supposed to be, how is it supposed to be used. And in this case, something that I don't like about blocks is the fact that blocks will make heavy use of the template code to establish its subscriptions, right? Because blocks as well does subscriptions, but the difference is that they are hidden away, so you don't see them. They are managed by blocks. You don't have to subscribe, unsubscribe. It does it for you. And it does also dependency injection for you. So it does a lot of stuff for you. Makes your life easier, right? So it's more friendly to a beginner. But when you have stuff that is beginner friendly, then it's not configurable, meaning that you cannot easily reassemble this code base into something else, or have, you know, places where you inject, you know, different features. And that's a bit you know, restrictive for a team that has like a large code base, experienced developers and so on. So in our case, by having, this block library, we were limited. It was like making our lives harder. So we spent some time, we thought about it, and we came up with this current solution. Now, you see, I'm talking about the fact that the same architecture could be beneficial for certain teams, and it could be not so beneficial for other teams. So I would say this stream setup is very good for teams that are expecting to grow a lot, that expect to have like a lot of flexibility in terms of like creating their code base. It's very good for those teams. Blocks is a great library for teams or small one-man army projects where like everything that gets built is like built in quick fashion, has to be completed fast, and has to be simple. Mostly, let's say, because like the lead developer or the only developer is not so skilled. So therefore, blocks is a great choice if you don't have that much skill in your, backlog. So you haven't been through many projects, therefore you are not sure how to do this and that and that. And that's why you would be more happy with blocks, because it hides away most of these complexities. And you can successfully use blocks or Riverpod for such projects, or even for complex projects. But once you go into the land of like making large scale projects, at some point you might want to have more control over how you handle each part of the call stack, right? And that's our particular view on things, and that's why we had this particular architecture of state store. So right now I'm not trying to say everyone should be using RX streams. I'm just trying to say, if you expect you want to become a highly skilled developer and your project is going to grow in time, maybe do consider this one. It will bring you a lot of benefits. But at the same time, it's nothing bad to use blocks or Riverpod or Redux or whatever is out there, right? You could even use change notifiers, and that would be just fine as long as you know what you are doing. So once again, having a state store, it forces you to become more self-aware how to assemble your code. And once you become more self-aware how code gets assembled, then you have far more skill, far fewer bugs. It makes your life easier. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, right? You need state store to be able to write easy to understand code, but the state store itself is hard. It pushes you to learn more. So yeah, it's a great way at trying to upgrade your skills. That's why I would recommend the state store. That's why I would recommend using RX. RX is a library that's used in multiple languages. So once you learn RX in Dart, then you can use RX in JavaScript. There is RX in Java, and you can find it all over the place. So that's very useful. And then again, like if you learn to use RX, you'll develop a better understanding of sync and async, concerns. And that makes your life easier as a developer. The moment you understand more, it's easier to find what's broken. And it's easier to write code that is not broken to start with, right? So these are some of the reasons of like saying yes or no for this particular architecture. That's like the concerns part. And yeah, many people would say, streams, especially RX streams, are heavyweight objects and they might take up some memory. And to this I can answer, well, look, we live in this day and age where like we have phones that are as good as like previous generation computers, right? And we have so much memory and I have multiple cores and all this stuff. So you are not fighting for every little scrap of CPU time and every little byte of memory. It's gone. This day and age is gone. At least for us, small app developers, we don't have to care about this stuff that much. If you go into other applications, maybe yes, then you care about performance at a more intimate level. But for us, we can afford, the luxury of using something that has a bit more memory footprint, but does more job for us. That's my argument for, RX is not that big of a deal, if you're writing, beginner project, or if you're writing something that will not be that demanding on your computer, you're fine with RX. Some would argue that Riverpod is a bit lighter weight. I cannot say from direct experience with Riverpod if there's like significant performance difference, but I can say it's probably negligible for projects that are not, large scale and that don't require high efficiency in memory and CPU usage. So at least for me, it's a mute point. I don't care about it. I'm a startup. I need to survive. I need to move fast. I need to have flexibility. I have other concerns. Once I manage to, get traction and get revenue and so, then I can start thinking about performance. For now, I don't care that much about it. Of course, I don't want to write shitty code that has no performance concerns. That's very bad to approach it this way. But you shouldn't be thinking about saving several bytes of memory. That's not going to change your life. It's not going to improve your, market performance. Users don't care about this. So, yeah, that's another argument in favor of using RX. It's not that huge of a blow if you use RX and they're a bit higher weight objects. You get a lot of benefit from them. There are operators that can merge streams, they can map streams, they can switch streams. There's a lot of cool stuff there. So it's worth the compromise. Now, another small point would be a bit about functional programming. And this probably would be a better, I would separate it in a separate section. Let's just do it this way. So for now, let's